Elena Harper, 34, laced up her running shoes in the pre-dawn quiet of her South Side Chicago apartment, the same routine she'd followed for years. Born and raised in Englewood, where the streets hummed with resilience and suspicion, she'd learned early that control was survival. Her older brother, Jamal, had been her hero, until he wasn't. At 16, he was arrested for loitering, cuffed in front of their neighbors for no reason other than being black and in the wrong place. The trauma broke him, turning a bright kid into a shadow who barely spoke. That memory drove Elena to the FBI, not for glory but to rewrite the rules that had crushed her brother. Now, as a special agent, she jogged every morning in Lincoln Park, not just for fitness but to reclaim the freedom her family had been denied. The air was crisp, the sky a soft gray as Elena's sneakers hit the gravel path. Her black leggings and teal tank top blended into the early morning, her braid swinging with each stride. The park was a haven, dog walkers, early risers, the occasional cyclist, but today, something felt off. A prickle ran down her spine, not from the chill but from a gaze she couldn't see. Years at the FBI had honed her instincts, she'd stood in crime scenes that whispered danger before they screamed it. She slowed, pretending to check her smartwatch, her eyes scanning without moving her head. A police cruiser sat at the trail's edge, lights off, its driver hidden behind a glinting windshield. Elena kept running, veering toward the lake where the path opened up, trees casting long shadows. She stopped to tie her shoe, a deliberate pause, and caught the cruiser's door creak open. A white officer stepped out, his badge catching the light, Daniel Callahan. His hand rested near his radio, a reflex she recognized from countless case files, control, not curiosity. "You out here early," he said, his voice rough, eyes narrowing. "We've had reports of suspicious people. You live around here?" The question wasn't innocent. Elena had heard it before, laced with the same assumption: a black woman didn't belong in a place like this. Her heart thudded, not from fear but from a memory, Jamal's face pressed against a squad car, his eyes pleading. She straightened, her voice steady. "I'm jogging. That's all." Callahan's jaw tightened, he wasn't used to answers without deference. He stepped closer, sunglasses slipping, revealing eyes that flickered with irritation. "Got ID? Phone? Wallet?" His tone was a command, not a request. Elena's training kicked in, calm, calculated. She thought of her brother, of the system that let officers like Callahan walk free while victims like Jamal faded. "I have my phone," she said, pointing to her pocket, "but you need cause to search me." His laugh was sharp, humorless. "You a lawyer now?" he taunted, stepping into her space. The air thickened, the park's quiet amplifying the tension. A jogger passed, glancing but not stopping. Elena's stance didn't waver. "I know my rights," she said, her voice a blade, sharp and controlled. Callahan's face flushed, his hand twitching toward his cuffs. He didn't ask again, he moved, a quick kick aimed at her wrist. The crack of her phone hitting the pavement echoed like a gunshot. Pain shot through her arm, but Elena didn't flinch. She saw Jamal's face, her mother's tears, the years of silence her community endured. In one fluid motion, she pivoted, her training as natural as breathing. Her hand hooked Callahan's knee, a precise pull, and he stumbled, his weight betraying him as he hit the grass with a thud. The park froze. A dog walker stopped, a cyclist slowed. Elena stood tall, her breath even, and reached into her waistband. She held up her FBI badge, the silver glinting in the morning light. "Special Agent Elena Harper," she said, her voice clear, cutting through the silence. Callahan's eyes widened, his breath catching as he lay sprawled, the weight of his mistake sinking in. Phones were out now, recording, the moment already spiraling beyond the park. Elena didn't move, her gaze locked on Callahan, not with anger but with a clarity that burned. This wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who'd been silenced. The video spread like wildfire across Chicago's digital veins. By noon, the 47-second clip, stitched from a cyclist's phone and a dog walker's shaky footage, had racked up thousands of views. Hashtags like #JusticeForElena and #ChicagoFBI trended on X, the moment of Elena's badge reveal frozen in screenshots, her calm defiance a stark contrast to Callahan's sprawled shock. News outlets picked it up, local anchors dissecting the FBI agent assaulted by Officer Engel. Elena sat in her apartment, the curtains half drawn, watching the chaos unfold on her laptop. Her wrist ached, bandaged from the impact, but the real pain was deeper, memories of Jamal's arrest, the way her mother's voice broke when she begged for answers at the precinct. Elena hadn't wanted this. Fame was a distraction, a spotlight that could burn as much as it illuminated. She'd joined the FBI to fix the system, not to become its poster child. But the messages pouring in, some calling her a hero, others slinging slurs, made it clear, she was no longer just Elena Harper, agent. She was a symbol, and symbols don't get to choose their meaning. Her phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor, "Stay off social media. Report to the office tomorrow." She exhaled, setting the phone down. The world was watching, but she felt alone, the weight of her brother's broken dreams pressing against her resolve. Across town, Daniel Callahan sat in his precinct's locker room, the air thick with the smell of sweat and coffee. His badge was gone, turned in after his suspension hit an hour after the video surfaced. The chief's words had been clinical, to preserve department integrity. Dan's hands trembled as he stared at his locker, his father's old police cap tucked inside. His dad had been a legend, a man who commanded respect with a glance. Dan had chased that legacy for 20 years, believing every citation, every closed case, made him untouchable. Now, the silence of his colleagues, once quick to joke, now avoiding his eyes, told him otherwise. He replayed the moment in the park. He'd seen a black woman jogging, assumed she didn't belong. It wasn't hate, he told himself, just instinct, honed by years in a system that rewarded snap judgments. But her badge, that glint of silver, had unraveled him. An FBI agent. Not just any agent, but one who didn't blink, didn't cower. He'd kicked her phone, expecting submission, and instead, he'd fallen, literally and figuratively. The video looped in his mind, his own voice accusing her, her steady gaze cutting through his authority like a knife. His phone buzzed with a message from an old partner, "You're on your own, Dan." He didn't reply. For the first time, Dan felt the system's shield slip, and the exposure burned. Elena drove to the FBI field office that evening, the city's lights blurring past. She thought of Jamal, how he'd stopped dreaming of college after his arrest, how the system had erased his voice. She parked, her badge heavy in her pocket, and walked inside. A colleague, a young analyst named Priya, met her at the elevator. "You okay?" Priya asked, her voice soft but urgent. Elena nodded, but her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. "I didn't want this to be about me," she said. Priya's hand grazed her shoulder. "It's not just you. It's all of us who've been misjudged." Elena's throat tightened. She wasn't alone, but the fight was just beginning, and she knew the system didn't bend easily. Elena sat at her desk in the Chicago FBI field office, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound in the empty room. Her computer screen glowed with a secure database, her temporary access from a prior case still active. She typed "Daniel Callahan complaint history" and hit enter. The results loaded slowly, a list of names and dates scrolling like a ghost story. One caught her eye, Marissa Thompson, 2016, complaint filed against Callahan for detaining her son, Malik, then 14, without cause during a school event. The case was marked, withdrawn, insufficient evidence. Elena's pulse quickened. She remembered Malik's story from a community meeting years ago, Marissa's quiet tears, her fear of losing her teaching job if she pushed harder. Elena's fingers paused over the keyboard. She thought of Jamal, his silence after his arrest, the way their mother had stopped trusting anyone in uniform. This wasn't just about Callahan, it was about a system that buried complaints to protect its own. She opened Malik's file, reading the sparse details: no video evidence, no witnesses contacted, case closed within a week. A handwritten note in the margin read, "Family declined to pursue." Elena's jaw clenched. She knew that silence wasn't consent, it was survival. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. The message was brief: "Some files are better left closed." No signature, no trace. Elena's heart raced, not from fear but from clarity. This was bigger than one officer. She saved the message, forwarded it to a secure server, and kept digging. Another name surfaced: Kayla Vasquez, 2018, detained for suspicious behavior at a bus stop. Callahan's report claimed she resisted. The complaint was dismissed. Elena cross-referenced the precinct's internal logs. A pattern emerged: complaints against Callahan were routed to the same supervisor, James Whitaker, and quietly shelved. Across the city, Dan sat in his small apartment, the TV muted, a news ticker replaying the park incident. His suspension had stripped him of routine, leaving him to face the man he'd become. He thought of his father, who'd taught him that a badge meant control, that respect was owed, not earned. Dan had followed that creed, dismissing complaints as troublemakers trying to game the system. But Elena's badge, her unflinching stare, had cracked that belief. He opened his laptop, searching for the viral video. The comments were brutal: "Racist cop gets owned, FBI queen shuts him down." Each word stung, not because they were lies, but because they held a truth he'd ignored. Dan's phone lit up, a text from a former colleague: "Whitaker's getting heat. They're looking at his sign-offs." Dan's stomach dropped. James Whitaker, his old supervisor, had buried complaints for years, always with a nod and a "we've got your back." Now, the system was turning, and Dan felt the ground shift. He remembered Malik Thompson, a kid he'd cuffed for looking wrong at a school fair. He'd written it off as routine, but now, under Elena's shadow, he saw it differently: another life marked by his indifference. Elena left the office late, the city quiet under a starless sky. As she walked to her car, a black sedan idled across the street, no plates visible. She slowed, her hand brushing her badge, her training keeping her calm. The car sped off, tires screeching. She didn't report it, not yet. She knew the system's tricks, the way it used silence to intimidate. But Elena wasn't Jamal, wasn't Marissa. She was an agent, and she'd learned long ago that silence was a weapon only if you let it be. Elena drove through Chicago's West Side, the streets lined with faded murals and corner stores, her mind on Marissa Thompson. She'd found Marissa's address in the old complaint file, a modest house in Austin where Marissa had raised Malik alone after her husband left. Elena parked, her badge tucked away, and knocked. Marissa opened the door, her eyes tired but sharp, a teacher's gaze that missed nothing. "You're the agent from the video," Marissa said, not a question. Elena nodded. "I'm here about Malik's case. I think it's connected to mine." Marissa's face tightened, a flicker of fear crossing it. "I withdrew that complaint," she said, her voice low. "I had to keep my job." Elena understood. Marissa wasn't just a mother, she was a survivor in a system that punished those who spoke up. "I'm not here to push," Elena said, "but if you have anything, notes, photos, I need it." Marissa hesitated, then stepped inside, leaving the door ajar. Minutes later, she returned with a small envelope, a photo of Malik's bruised wrist, a time-stamped school absence note, and a copy of the complaint she'd never sent. "I kept this," Marissa said, "but who was I supposed to trust?" Elena took the envelope, her hands steady but her heart heavy. She saw Jamal in Malik's story, another kid whose future was scarred by a badge. "Thank you," she said, meeting Marissa's eyes. "This won't be buried again." Marissa nodded, a faint spark of hope in her gaze, but also fear. Be careful, she whispered. They don't like people who dig. Elena drove away, the envelope on her passenger seat, feeling the weight of every silenced voice it represented. Meanwhile, Dan sat in a diner, the kind his father used to take him to after shifts, all chrome and greasy menus. His lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Carla, slid a folder across the table. "We can file a countersuit," she said. "Defamation, emotional distress. You followed protocol." Dan stared at the folder, his father's voice echoing, "A badge means you're right." But Elena's badge, her steady gaze, had shattered that. "Will it work?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Carla paused. "You didn't used to doubt yourself, Dan." He looked away, the diner's hum fading. He'd intimidated complainants before, Marissa, others, knowing the system would back him. Now, it was silent, and he felt exposed, a man without armor. Elena's office phone rang that evening, an unknown number. "Agent Harper," a man's voice said, calm but deliberate. "Some cases aren't worth reopening. They're messy, and no one's left to clean them up." The line went dead. Elena's pulse spiked, but she didn't flinch. She'd faced threats before, but this one came too close to Whitaker's name in the files. She printed Callahan's complaint archive, every page stamped and numbered, and stored it in a locked drawer. The system was watching, but so was she, and she wasn't backing down, not when Jamal's memory, Marissa's courage, and her own duty demanded she keep going. Elena stood in the federal courthouse, her black suit crisp, her expression unreadable. She'd filed the lawsuit against the Chicago Police Department for excessive force and civil rights violations, her lawyer, Priya Sharma, by her side. The filing was quiet, no press conference, no cameras, but by noon, the news broke. "FBI agent sues Chicago PD," screamed headlines, paired with the viral video still of Elena's badge and Callahan's stunned face. X erupted with support, #ElenaStrong trended alongside stories of Marissa Thompson and others. But the backlash was swift. Anonymous accounts called her a deep state pawn, a doctored image of her in a militarized uniform spreading online. Elena sat in her office, scrolling through the hate. One message stung: "You'll never be safe, traitor." She thought of Jamal, how he'd stopped meeting her eyes after his arrest, the shame he carried for something he didn't do. She closed her laptop, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just her fight, it was for every kid like Malik, every mother like Marissa, silenced by a system that protected its own. Priya knocked, her face grim. "They're circling Whitaker now. His sign-offs are under scrutiny." Elena nodded. "Good. Let it unravel." Dan, meanwhile, sat in his lawyer's office, the city's skyline mocking him through the window. Carla laid out the countersuit plan again, but Dan barely listened. He remembered his father's pride at award ceremonies, the way colleagues clapped for his decisive action. Now, those same colleagues avoided him, their silence louder than any reprimand. A news alert pinged, former supervisor implicated in Callahan cover UPS. James Whitaker's name, once a shield, was now a liability. Dan's chest tightened. He'd relied on Whitaker to bury complaints, to keep the machine running. Now, the machine was turning on him. Elena drove home that night, noticing a car tailing her for 2 blocks before it vanished. She didn't report it, there was no proof, just instinct. But she changed her locks, varied her routes. The system's pushback wasn't loud, it was subtle, like the threats she'd faced as a kid in Englewood, where speaking up meant risking everything. She thought of Marissa's envelope, the photo of Malik's bruise. Elena wasn't fighting for headlines, she was fighting for the truth, for the voices the system had tried to erase. And as the city buzzed with her name, she knew the real battle was just beginning. Dan Callahan sat on a metal bench in the precinct parking lot, his suspension now a month old. The air smelled of exhaust and rain, the city's pulse distant but relentless. His phone was silent, no texts from old partners, no calls from the union. He'd always thought loyalty was the system's currency, but now he saw it for what it was, a transaction, void when you became a liability. He thought of his father, who'd died a hero in the department's eyes, his name on a plaque at the station. Dan had chased that legacy, believing every cuff, every report, brought him closer. But Elena's badge, her unyielding stare, had exposed the truth. He'd been chasing power, not justice. He opened X, the video still circulating. Comments called him a racist, a thug in uniform. He wanted to argue, he hadn't hated Elena, he just acted on instinct, the way his father taught him. But the memory of Malik Thompson's scared eyes at that school fair, the way Dan had dismissed Marissa's complaint, gnawed at him. He'd told himself it was routine, that kids like Malik needed tough love. Now, he saw it through Elena's lens, a kid humiliated, a mother silenced. His father's voice faded, replaced by a question, what kind of man am I? Elena, meanwhile, sat in a coffee shop near the courthouse, reviewing case files with Priya. The lawsuit had grown, pulling in more victim stories. Kayla Vasquez, a nurse detained for looking suspicious, Jamal Edwards, whose name echoed her brother's. Each file was a wound, a reminder of why she'd joined the FBI. Priya slid a document across the table. Whitaker's testifying tomorrow, she said. He's claiming he followed protocol. Elena's eyes narrowed. Protocol doesn't bury evidence. She thought of the threats, the anonymous call, the car with no plates. The system was fighting back, but so was she, fueled by Jamal's memory and Marissa's courage. Dan drove to his childhood home, now empty, his father's old badges displayed on a shelf. He picked one up, the metal cold. He'd once worn his own badge with pride, 29 pride, believing it made him untouchable. Now, it felt like a lie. He thought of Elena, her calm strength, and the kids he'd cuffed without question. The weight of his actions pressed down, not just the park incident but every time he'd looked away, trusting the system to cover him. He set the badge down, his hands shaking. The system wasn't his shield anymore, it was his mirror, and he didn't like what he saw. Dan walked into the Community Reconciliation Center, a low-slung building in Chicago's Roseland neighborhood, where the air smelled of dust and hope. His sentence, 2 years of community labor and 6 months of behavioral reformation, had brought him here, stripped of his badge, his gun, his old life. The center wasn't a prison, it was a place to listen, to confront the stories he'd once ignored. On his first day, he sat in a circle of folding chairs, facing a 17-year-old named Marcus, whose story mirrored Malik Thompson's. Marcus spoke of being cuffed at a bus stop, his voice steady but his eyes haunted. "You made me feel like nothing," he said, looking at Dan like I wasn't even human. Dan's hands gripped his knees, his throat tight. He wanted to explain, to say he was just doing his job, but Marcus's words cut deeper than any accusation. He saw his father's shadow in his own actions, the way he dismissed kids like Marcus as threats without evidence. The facilitator, a soft-spoken woman named Clara, didn't push Dan to respond. The rule was simple: listen, don't defend. Dan listened, each word a weight, forcing him to see the faces he'd turned away from: Malik, Kayla, countless others. For the first time, he didn't look away. Elena sat in her apartment, the TV off, her mind on the upcoming trial. The lawsuit had grown beyond her, a movement now, with Marissa Thompson speaking at community vigils, her son's photo a quiet testament. Elena's inbox was flooded, support from strangers, threats from faceless accounts. One email stood out, unsigned: "I closed a file in 2017. I was wrong. I have copies if you need them." Elena's heart raced. The system was cracking, voices like Marissa's breaking through. She thought of Jamal, how he deserved better, how she was fighting for him now. Dan left the center that evening, the sky bruising purple. Marcus's words echoed, "You made me feel like nothing." Dan had always thought power was control, but now he saw it was responsibility, a responsibility he'd failed. He drove past his old precinct, the lights dim, the plaque with his father's name a distant memory. He didn't stop. He wasn't that man anymore, not the one who followed orders blindly. The center had no bars, but it held a mirror, and Dan was starting to face it, one story at a time. The community forum was held in a worn community center on Chicago's South Side, no banners, just a handwritten sign, "Time to listen." Elena arrived early, sitting in the third row, her notebook closed. She'd come at the request of a local organizer, not as an agent but as a neighbor, a sister, a voice. The room filled slowly, mothers, students, retirees, their faces a mix of hope and weariness. Elena's heart was steady, but her mind flickered to Jamal, to Marissa, to the envelope that had started to shift the tide. She wasn't here to speak, only to be present. Dan entered quietly, his gray shirt plain, no trace of the officer he'd been. Elena recognized him, not by his face but by the weight he carried, a man no longer shielded by a badge. He sat in the back, eyes down, the room's quiet wrapping around him. The organizer, a young woman named Lena, opened the forum with a simple question: "What does justice mean to you?" A mother spoke first, her voice raw, recounting her daughter's wrongful detainment. Elena listened, her chest tight, seeing Jamal in every word. Dan listened too, his hands still, his face unreadable but attentive. When Dan was invited to speak, he stood, no notes, no defense. "I thought I was keeping order," he said, his voice low but clear. "I was wrong. I didn't see the people I hurt." The room stilled, not with anger but with a heavy acknowledgement. Elena didn't look at him, but she felt the shift, a man owning his past, not to be forgiven but to be seen. She thought of Jamal, how no one had listened when he needed it. Now, she was here, listening, not for Dan but for the room, for the truth. The forum ended without fanfare, no applause, just a quiet exit. Elena lingered, her notebook in her bag, her presence enough. Dan left without a word, but his steps were different, lighter, not from relief but from a choice to stay. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The space they shared wasn't about reconciliation, it was about showing up, about refusing to let silence win again. The federal courthouse was quiet under a gray Chicago sky, the air heavy with anticipation. Elena sat in the third row, her suit plain, her face calm but resolute. Across the room, Dan Callahan sat beside his lawyer, his tie neat but his eyes distant, as if searching for the man he used to be. The gallery was packed, Marissa Thompson in the front, holding a photo of Malik, law students scribbling notes, reporters typing furiously. The judge, a woman with a reputation for fairness, struck the gavel. The verdict was coming, and the room held its breath. The prosecution had laid out the case: Callahan's kick, his history of complaints, Whitaker's cover-ups. Witnesses, including Marcus from the Rehabilitation Center, had spoken plainly, their stories echoing Marissa's and Jamal's. The judge's voice was steady: no drama. Daniel Callahan is found guilty of abuse of authority and violation of civil rights. Penalties include permanent revocation of law enforcement credentials, 2 years of community labor, and 6 months of behavioral reformation. Dan didn't flinch, didn't look down. His face was a mask, but his hands trembled, the weight of his father's legacy gone. Elena felt no triumph, only a quiet relief. This wasn't about her, it was about Malik, Kayla, Jamal, and every name buried in files. Marissa's eyes met hers, a silent thank you passing between them. The verdict wasn't just a ruling, it was a crack in the system, a moment where silenced voices were heard. Outside, the news spread fast, headlines, hashtags, Marissa's quote, "Justice is when the right aren't treated as wrong." Elena left the courthouse, her steps steady, her heart full. She'd kept her promise to Jamal, to her community, to herself. Dan walked out alone, the city's hum distant. He didn't call his lawyer, didn't check his phone. The verdict wasn't a surprise, but it was a mirror, showing him a man who'd lost his way. He thought of Marcus, of the center, of the stories he couldn't unhear. The system hadn't saved him, but the truth might. He wasn't his father anymore, he was just Dan, and for the first time, that was enough to start over. 3 weeks after the verdict, Dan began his community labor at the Reconciliation Center, a place of cracked walls and honest voices. He sat in a circle, listening to a woman named Carla, who spoke of her brother's wrongful arrest, her words sharp but not cruel. Dan didn't look away. He saw Malik in her story, felt the weight of his own silence. Each day, he scrubbed floors, served meals, listened to stories. A teenage girl, Lena, asked him, "Did you ever think we were scared?" Dan met her eyes. "I didn't think," he said. "That was my mistake." The room didn't applaud, but it listened, and that was enough. Elena walked the south side streets, the air warm with summer's promise. She'd returned to work, her badge a quiet reminder of why she fought. Marissa had started a community group, speaking for Malik and others, her voice no longer silenced. The lawsuit had sparked reform, new oversight, reopened files, Whitaker's retirement. Elena felt Jamal's presence, not as pain but as purpose. She stopped by a mural of kids playing, their faces bright, and smiled. She'd given them a chance to be heard, and that was her victory. The community center hosted another forum, smaller now, no cameras. Dan spoke again, not for redemption but for truth. "I was wrong," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here to make sure it stops." Elena sat in the back, listening, her heart calm. They didn't need to forgive or forget, just to move forward, together, in a space where silence was no longer a weapon. The system was shifting, not with noise but with voices, and Elena knew she'd helped light the way. To everyone who's followed this journey, thank you. You've walked with Elena through pain, courage, and triumph, and with Dan through reckoning and change. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button on Revenge Ties and join us, where every voice tells a story of struggle, truth, and new beginnings. Share it, comment, and keep speaking your own truth. We'll meet you at the table.